Finally, we're going to discuss post-impressionism. And really, what does post-impressionism mean? It just means after impressionism. So it's not a very creative title, but you get the point. And the reason why we talk about it as post-impressionism is there's still a lot of influence from the impressionist style on this movement, but there is a key difference, and I would say that is their use of color here. Where I feel like Impressionist artists were using color in a very realistic way, Post Impressionists, to me, use color emotionally. They use the color to pump up the emotion in the scene. I also think that the brushwork here is a bit more energetic than you see in Impressionist pieces. It often gives off a feeling of energy. That, again, I think is a little bit more limited in Impressionist works. So, those are the key differences I really think you might note when looking at Post Impressionist pieces. And there aren't as many artists that are considered post-impressionist. Really, the main one that we really talk about, of course, is Vincent van Gogh. And we'll also talk about Paul Gauguin as well. As I mentioned, sometimes people want to say that Toulouse-Lautrec is a post-impressionist because they look at something like Van Gogh's Night Cafe and see a lot of similarities between this piece and the Moulin Rouge piece, for instance. And that's why I would say I can see the argument on both sides. To me, I can see valid reasons for placing Toulouse-Lautrec in either camp. So I tell my students you kind of have to make the decision for yourself, I suppose. Van Gogh, of course, is pretty much known by anybody, even if you don't know a lot about art history, mainly because of his tragic history. Um, he was born to a family that was very, very religious. He's Dutch, hence the name. And his parents really seemed to want him to go into the church, right? Go into the monastery, perhaps. And so he always felt he sort of disappointed them by going off and having this artist life. There seems to be some themes in his work of struggling to reconcile the religious nature of his parents' upbringing and his choices. He also seemed to just be kind of unstable throughout his life. There's different theories on why he really didn't have a lot of stability to his life. And the one that most people embrace now is that he actually was an undiagnosed epileptic, that he had seizures throughout his life. But at this point in time, they didn't understand epilepsy. And so many people think that what was happening is that he was having these episodes and not knowing how to really deal with them. It was coming off as like, oh, I have bad spirits in me and things like that. He had a lot of mental anguish, right, in his life. He committed himself into asylum multiple times. There is the ability to self commit, and so he would often self commit himself. And so he struggled a lot with his psyche, his mentality, and just overall had a very, very, sort of difficult time being him. We get the impression. He did a lot of works of his doctor at the asylum, Dr. Gachet. So if you Google Dr. Gachet, you'll find a lot of portraits that Van Gogh did of him. And yeah, so he seems to have a very sort of difficult road. His only real connection seemed to be to his brother Theo, who was an art critic. And then he met the painter Gauguin later in his life, and he had some connection to Gauguin, but unfortunately Gauguin left him in the south of France and went off to Tahiti. We'll talk about that. And that seemed to be a big blow to Van Gogh's psyche. Some people suggest the cutting off of the ear wasn't over a woman, it was over Gauguin leaving him. And, people don't necessarily mean that they were lovers. They mean that he just had such a tight friendship and bond with Gauguin, and that perhaps Gauguin leaving sort of devastated him. So he had a very, very difficult road. He eventually commits suicide. He only sold one artwork during his life. And I think you'd be very surprised to hear about his reputation today, where his works go for upwards of, $80 million at last auction I checked. So, his artworks go for an astronomical sum of money. So I think, he'd be surprised to find this out about himself today. And the reason why we think Van Gogh's artwork didn't sell very well is because he was very much on the cutting edge of style. That he was using these compositions, like the one you see here, they were starting to defy, the rules of composition making. If you'll notice, the pool table almost looks like it's going to tilt up and roll towards us. There's, again, these hints of abstraction coming at us a little bit, defying of space, cubist attitude, perhaps. And then, of course, it was his outrageous use of color. And to me, the color is very much about creating moods. For instance, a night cafe to me is a place of negative energy or moody energy, energy that you're not sure what's exactly going on here. And his quote about this place was, "This is a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime." Great place to hang out, right? So, again, he seems to be using the color to communicate sort of the vibe of this space, might we say. Just like the Moulin Rouge piece by Toulouse-Lautrec, I think it's a very alienating group of people. They seem disconnected from themselves and each other. And you have the barman kind of standing in the center as this denizen of this world, that he's overseeing. And again, there's this feeling of uncomfortability I always get looking at the painting. I think it's the use of the red. Using red in this kind of extreme way often makes you feel uncomfortable. It's a very sort of unsettling color. And I often tell my students that if you look at it in design, you'll notice that a lot of restaurants use it, because this idea is that you'll start to feel uncomfortable in the space and eat your meal quickly and go so they can turn the table again. Um, so there's these ways that you can use color to create emotions or create, sort of reactions. And again, the use of the red seems to be communicating something along those lines here. The other thing I'll briefly mention, of course, is the lights kind of radiating the energy. That's something you'll see later in Futurism. So keep an eye out for that later when we look at Futurist artworks. You'll see it there. But again, Van Gogh seemed to live a tough life, and to me, he creates these spaces that reflects some of his own feeling about the world around him. This, of course, is his probably most famous work that people know, which is Starry Night. I wanted you to get a sense that these actually usually aren't very large paintings, because when we look at them in a slide, they're very, very big. So I took a photo of my husband, right, with the painting when we were at the MoMA in New York to get a sense of scale, right, for the work. But again, it's not a very, very big piece. His works tended to be much more intimate. But again, they're overwhelming a lot because of the use of the color and the use of the energy within the compositions. Here you can see the energy of the composition really well. This roiling night sky, kind of roiling above and around, right? You definitely pick that up, right, in this work. And this work was a very personal one for him. He painted it when he was in the asylum. Every now and then he'd self-commit, and this was the view out his window. And many people interpret the painting as his sort of feeling of isolation or disconnection written on the canvas, and him trying to reconcile sort of, feeling alienated and the choices that he made and such. If you look into the town, you'll notice there's a church steeple that sort of connects the heavens and the earth. And then you have the cypress tree that in the foreground closest to us, and cypress trees are actually symbols of Christ. So many people nod a little bit at the religious overtones here and say, there seems to be something here that he's contemplating. It's not just, a landscape, or it's not just empty. It seems to have some kind of metaphysical, existential kind of reason for it existing for him. But, he paints the sky as he sees it and visualizes it. And more as we move forward in the course, I'll be talking to you about artists that they don't paint things as they appear. They paint them as they want them to appear, or they believe they appear, maybe how they actually see them. So there's this sense of disconnecting a bit from reality as we move forward into talking about more modern and contemporary artists. And I think Van Gogh is one of the first that I really see that I think he's creating his own world. He's creating his own vision of what he wants the world to be, rather than replicating what he sees, in its exactitude. But again, this is a little bit different than what the Impressionists were doing. The Impressionists were thinking about the technical challenges of trying to capture a moment in time. And I think what Van Gogh was trying to do is capture what he saw in his head, his emotions themselves. So this is why, to me, he's not an impressionist. He's doing something a bit different from what they were doing. But obviously, a lot of the brushstroke work and the compositional work here is inspired by them. It takes off from that position and just enhances it more, right, as far as a purpose is concerned. But this is a gorgeous work, and again, I think it speaks a lot to his style. The other artist I want to show you that's a post-impressionist artist is Paul Gauguin. And Paul Gauguin, he's kind of a hard artist for me to talk about because his biography is just so terrible. He came from a banker's background. He had been a banker. He is married. I believe he had like 5 children. And up out of nowhere, he just abandons his family to go become a painter. So, you kind of like, well, what a jerk. And then he makes his way south in France and he meets up with Van Gogh, and they actually end up living together for a while and painting together in the south of France. But he eventually abandons him too. And then he leaves and goes to the French colony of Tahiti, right? In the Polynesians, right? He basically leaves France, gets on a boat, and goes to Tahiti, and starts this whole new life for himself. When he arrives there, he is rumored to have spent a lot of time with the native ladies. So again, to me, he's sort of this hard person to discuss because he's sort of this awful person, and he acts in a very colonialist manner. Even when I look at a painting like this, Spirit of the Dead Watching, the way that he presents the native woman, the Tahitian woman, on display, it reeks of colonialism. It reeks of exotic erotic. In a way that I don't know. I don't know how I should feel about the work. It feels very predatory in a way. It feels like very much about exploiting her. So even though he was a great painter, his subject matter to me, I'm just sort of, I bristle a bit at it, I guess. But if you look at his works, you'll notice that he's using these Tahitian subjects, right? The locals. But then he's interspersing it with that vibrant color and that vibrant use of pattern that post-impressionists are really, really well known for. To me, this is sort of like a European nude reinvented, rebranded through the subject matter and through the style itself. This is another work he did, La Orana Maria, or Hail Mary. It's sort of a re-envisionment of the Virgin Mary story. And once again, I don't really know how to feel about these paintings because he's imposing Christianity upon these people. He's making them be play actors in this drama that's not theirs. And notice that with Mary, he puts her in a red garment, which, red and blue are very important colors in Christian mythology, symbology. Mary's color is blue. It's Marian blue. We call it Marian blue. It symbolizes her. She always wears it. So to put her in red, red is the color of harlots and sluts and whores. You're kind of left going, what is he trying to say here? And then the 3 wise men in the background as these Tahitian ladies, with bare breasts, and I don't know. Again, I think he meant to be quirky and inventive, but I just kind of I'm like, I don't know. It seems very colonialist to me. Um, but again, look at each piece and think about the color, the emotion in them. It's very post-impressionist stuff. So it's gorgeous to look at, just problematic as far as subject is concerned. And this is my favorite that he did, Day of the God, where many people interpret the painting as the god statue. Because when the French arrive here, these are people who are polytheists. They worship multiple gods. They're not Christians. They are converted by the French. So that's another colonial thing you have to talk about. But the god statue kind of stands in the middle. And if you look in the front part of the painting, many people think Gauguin was trying to say these were the indigenous people before the French. They're childlike, they're immoral, right? They're naked. And then in the back, some people suggest that that's after the French came. They're industrious, so wearing clothes. So this almost sort of flip between the more primitive animal aspects of who they were and the industrious civilized aspects of who they would become under the French. Again, why I find Gauguin kind of hard to talk about because I'm like, well, that just seems sort of pompous, But that's how many people read the painting. I love thinking about the post-impressionist use of color. It distracts me from the bad subject matter a bit. But you have this use of the water in front of them. You have these like swirls and sort of spills of color, all kind of sort of swirling together in this very post-impressionist way. And again, I'll leave you thinking about that idea for our next lecture. This idea of painting what you want to see, not painting what is really there. And I think that water is a nice opening to looking at like expressionism and cubism and futurism in our talks to come.